Hi, it's Naomi again, and this video is following on from the last video that I created, which goes a little bit more deeply into how the parts of us that get activated when we are struggling in the midst of a compulsion or an addiction or some kind of habit that we feel powerless to stop, how those parts may, for you, be interacting within your internal family of different parts. And I mentioned this on the last video, I'm going to mention it again. Be aware of your own experience. It may not be like this, and it may be that you don't find it so useful to kind of map out parts like I have. But what I'm going to throw your way right now is a sort of general tendency of the parts that I became aware of in myself, the parts that I have noticed in some of the people that I work with, and what you potentially may be noticing for yourself as well. But like I said, stay aware, stay awake. Know that I'm not the expert here telling you what you should be experiencing or what I think you're experiencing. Your experience trumps everything. This may or may not be useful. So to illustrate what I mean, I'm going to go right ahead and share my slides with you. So, what's this? So, this is what I call the cycle of compulsion and addiction. And it's a kind of very simplified, very two-dimensional depiction of what can often happen for us when we're caught up in some kind of negative habit or addiction that we have in our lives. And I'm going to start with this curious little question mark. Now, in the previous video, I talked a little bit about exiles, and exiles being parts of us that hold feelings and beliefs and emotions that feel painful and difficult and hurtful, and that other parts of us want to protect us from. It actually comes from within ourselves, within our beings, but by keeping those feelings, those experiences buried inside us, those protective parts can feel like things are in balance for us, and if they have to reach for a glass of wine to do that, then they will go to those lengths, and then they will do that. Their most vital priority is that we don't experience pain and suffering. And the reason that I've put a question mark here rather than the word exile is because I'd like you to be really open to what those triggers are for you. What is it that has you reaching for the bottle of wine? And it may be as simple as, well, that's what I do when I get home from work. It's what I've done for a long time. It's a pattern for me. It's a routine for me. It helps me chill out. It helps me relax. But I wonder whether back when this pattern started to form, there were some other experiences beneath that created this pattern. And I wonder whether there still are experiences within yourself that are bringing about the decision to reach for that bottle. So I openly invite you to be curious about what this question mark is for you. A little experience that I had with my own compulsion to reach for chocolate cake and biscuits and other types of donuts, etc., pastries. There was just no limit to my sweet tooth. Was coldness, actually. When I got cold, for some reason, instead of reaching for a blanket or getting my body moving or putting the central heating on, I would reach for sugary food. And I needed to go back and explore some periods of time in my early life where I hadn't been warm, and where this had been a real fearful burden for me, whether this had put in place some kind of fear about being able to feel safe. And for whatever reason, those sugary treats helped me to distract from that experience. But the experience of soothing that I actually needed, the self-care that I needed, wasn't actually delivered. So that protective strategy in some ways was ineffectual. And it could be that that's the case for you. It could be that any kind of soothing that happens is short-lived, or it could be that you find that the reasons aren't exactly clear. And that doesn't prevent us from exploring, to not really be clear at this stage what the triggers might be, but just to have that question mark there can be really, really valuable. I will also say that I've spoken about exiles, and I've hinted that those triggers may come from our earlier lives and difficulties that we experienced them that kind of got remembered by our systems. But those experiences can also come from from before our lives. They can come from our ancestry. They can come from our family line. They can be habits of addiction that get passed down through family lines. That's very common, and it is certainly true for my family. So that we find ourselves with a certain propensity to reach for biscuits, for example, or for someone else it might be beer, because that's what our father did, or grandfather, or someone in our family line. And there's some way in which we've taken this on through generations. So you can see that this question mark is quite a big one, and it's a rich one, and it's not one that you have to kind of crack the code for overnight. So at the moment, I invite you to just start to get curious. So I spoke about this part before. This is the firefighter stroke distractor. This is the one that actually has us feel that we can edge away from whatever it is in that question mark that feels difficult, that feels distressing. And by doing that, it will reach for our chosen addiction, our chosen soothing strategy. What happens then is often that a manager will try to manage that. And actually those distractors can be quite powerful. So at first it may be that there's no manager that we notice. There's no part of us that wants to be doing anything other than indulging in what we're indulging in. Watching that extra episode on Netflix, or reading that extra chapter in our book when we know we're tired, for example. But usually the experience of pleasure and escape is short-lived when the action comes from a motivated firefighter part of us. And what normally happens is that there can be some criticism that comes in, or some kind of way in which another part of us, this manager, tries to counter that action with some kind of control. So for me, as an ex-problem eater, I used to overeat, and then I would go on a diet. And the overeating was coming from my firefighter, my distractor, and the going on the diet decision was coming from my manager. So it's some way in which this experience of distracting and firefighting, and the action that follows from that, is then countered by another part of us that doesn't want that to have happened, and wants to sort of almost do damage control. And if even just a criticism about that, and a promise to be different in our head is what this manager comes up with, that's very much a reaction that doesn't come necessarily from our deeper self. And you can see that I've written our deeper self right there in the middle, that sun that I was talking about in the last video, the warming sun that can actually start to soften and slow this cycle of compulsion and addiction through being curious about these parts, through finding out what they're up against, through helping them soften their often quite charged and quick actions, right? So sometimes we're eating before we know it, and then we're self-harming inside ourselves before we know it. We're criticizing, we're throwing some hatred at ourselves. And then what happens, interestingly, with this, you can see the right-hand arrow, is that oftentimes the actions or the opinions of that manager that says, for me, it was you're fat, you're greedy, get a control of yourself, go on this diet, do this exercise regime. For others, it can be, right, that's it, I want you to go on a complete detox, or I want you to work like a maniac, or whatever it has as their plan for getting back control. What often happens is that actually ends up re-triggering whatever this question mark for you, this original trigger could have been. So whether that's the shame that can come up through being told by a part of ourselves that we're not good enough, that shame then creating the sense that we need to keep distracting ourselves, that painful experience of shame being something that we then need to soothe or numb out from. We can see how the different parts link together, how they almost keep the cycle going, each of them reacting to the other. Because of course, the more we tell ourselves that we're useless and rubbish for going back to that addiction or that compulsion, the more ashamed of ourselves, the more unhappy, the more distressed, the more fearful, the more lonely, etc. we're going to be feeling. And then the more we're going to need to feel that actually we are distracting ourselves from all of those painful feelings. So there is somewhere, and many places, in fact, in this cycle, you can see all the gaps between the arrows. There are many places where we can get some pause, we can get some stillness, we can get some curiosity, and we can start to slow this cycle down a little bit so that we can see a little bit more clearly what's happening here. And as you can see from the beautiful rays of this self, it is the self, which is us, actually. It's our attention, it's our curiosity, it's our warmth, it's our awareness towards our parts and towards that trigger, whatever that might be for you, the multiple things that combine to create this issue in your life. We can start to soften and become aware of and transform and find freedom from this through the very act of our awareness, our curiosity. So I'm just going to go ahead and give one more slide, which is just to illustrate through the use of these cogs. I really like this concept, which I suddenly thought, oh, you know what? In a mechanical way, when one cog turns, and that can be, I guess, the firefighter, the one that reaches out, the distractor, the one that quickly gets up and makes another cup of milky chai, or suddenly has us backing away from something that we've been facing and doing something in a distracted way. Whatever it is for you, the cog starts to turn, and sooner or later, maybe even during that activity, that behavior, we can even be wishing we weren't doing it. We can be telling ourselves that we're rubbish. We can be making promises we won't do it again. This will be the last time. However that criticism or judgment comes out for you, that almost gets activated, almost like a cog linking into another cog. And then as that turns, there's shame. So wherever there's a shaming part, there's always a part that feels the shame. And what happens is that the shame reservoir grows. The more we criticize and blame ourselves, the more we feel rubbish about ourselves. And the more that the shame grows, of course, the cog also links back into the addictive behavior. And we're going to want to drown that out. We're going to want to distract ourselves from that too. So I hope that gives some little illustration into how the different parts of us may be interacting. I'm going to reiterate it one more time. Allow yourself to be the true, wise, witnessing judge of your own experience, rather than me. But see if these concepts, these ideas, spark any interest for you, and follow those lines of curiosity. It may be that they do. As always, reach out to me with any questions from this video content. I look forward to connecting and our paths crossing very soon. Bye-bye.